So as I mentioned yesterday, I'm hosting a hackathon and it is sponsored by Convex. And I wanted to make a quick little tutorial video just to show you how to get started with Convex. It's actually super straightforward. I'm going to go to their Next.js quick start guide and we're going to try to follow this. So I'm going to go ahead and run this to set up the latest Next.js application. I'll just go ahead and do it in my current folder, which is called Convex in minutes. All right, Next.js is set up. Now let's go ahead and run npm install convex so we can get that as a dependency of our project. And while that's also running, let's go back and we're going to run npx convex dev when that is done. All right, so when you run this for the first time in a new project, and it may ask you to kind of set up your Convex configuration, you can just go ahead and say, I want to create a new project and I'm going to use the name of this directory that we're in. And once you've done that, you'll get access to your Convex dashboard where you can see up here, we have that project that we just created. And we have access to see all the functions in the database and the files and the logs and other things inside of this dashboard. This dashboard ends up becoming really useful when you're trying to do your development and prototyping because you can kind of go through here and just invoke things manually if you want to. And I might show you some of that functionality. Second thing we're going to do is let's just go ahead and run my next app. All right, let's go down real quick. Before you can get started with Next.js, you do have to create a convex client provider.tsx. So I'm going to go here, my app directory, and let's just create one. And we're going to copy all that code, paste it in, save it. And then secondly, we're going to be using this provider inside of our layout. So let's go and import that at the top. And then down here, we're going to use that line to wrap our children. Okay, that's all you have to do. Now you're set up with Convex. You can start interacting with queries, mutations, and actions. So I'm going to try to keep this little overview as fast and simple as possible, which means that we're not going to be building out anything crazy. We're just going to do like a to-do list tracker. The first thing I want to cover in Convex is that you have this Convex directory that gets set up when you do npx convex dev. And inside of this directory, you have the ability to define your schemas. You can create your files that have actions, mutations, and queries. What we want to do is I'm going to make a new one called like to-do or to-dos, whatever you want to call it. And you can put any type of things in here, right? So in our case, we want the ability for the user to add in a to-do list item inside our Convex database. So inside of this directory, I'm actually going to go to the mutations documentation, and we're going to go ahead and just bring in these two imports like so. And then we want to export a function. So I'll say export const create to-do is equal to mutation. And then we can go ahead and pass that an object that has a handler function in it. Okay. So this is how you can basically write data into your Convex database. You have to use a mutation. And if you go and read up about mutations, you'll find out that basically everything you do inside a mutation is transactional. So you can't really contact a third-party API inside a mutation. Those would have to be done in actions. Okay. So for a mutation, it's just taking some data and store it in the database. So how do you actually take in some data? Well, there's another argument here called args that you can pass to the mutation. And I'm going to go ahead and just define what needs to come in. I'm going to go ahead and say this thing needs to take in some text as a property, and I'll say v.string. Okay. So now if you were to call this from the front end, it's going to tell you that, hey, you need to pass it some text. So now that we have this as an argument, let's go ahead and set up two different arguments for the handler. We have context, which is going to have your variables needed to write things to the database. And then you also have args, which if you hover over it, you'll see you have text here. So pretty straightforward. We're just going to say await. We'll say context.db.insert. But notice that you have a bunch of other methods here. You can do queries, patches, replaces. I'm going to do insert. And you're going to pass as a string of whatever database that you want. In our case, we're going to say to-dos. And we're going to pass in text is equal to args.text. Okay, now before I dive into showing you how to integrate the front end with this, I do want to mention that there's something called an internal mutation that you can also use. And this is useful if you don't want the mutation to ever be accessed from the front end. Okay, so you can actually have actions invoke other internal mutations or like, kind of like private queries, internal mutations, internal actions. This gives you the extra security. But in our case, we do want this to be accessed from the front end. So we're going to make that a public mutation. Now let's go back to the page here. And in order to get this going, let's just make a form. And we'll make a input. And we'll make a button that says create. Okay, now on the form, we'll say on submit. We're going to go ahead and take in a E, and I'll say prevent default. And we're going to have to basically call the mutation here at some point. And for the input, I'm going to go ahead and just track some state here. So I'll say const text set text. equals use state of empty string. And then we will say value is equal to text. And on change, we will say e set text e.target.value. Make sure you auto import that. And I'm also going to add a use client to the top of this since we are using hooks here. Okay, so now that we have a form and when you submit it, we should have access to the thing that the user typed in. What we also want to do is I'm going to go ahead and try to call the mutation. So with Convex, you can actually bring in that mutation if you want to. Like I said, create to do is equal to use mutation. Go ahead and auto import that. And then we're also going to import an API object. And notice that this has the autocomplete for the to-dos file that you just created and the create to do method that you just created, right? So that's auto correcting for this file and this method. And as you add more mutations and queries, those will show up. So let's go ahead and call this. So now we have a function that we can go down here. We can just call it, and we're going to pass it text. So going back to our UI, let's just go ahead and type in some stuff. I think the text is white for some reason. Let's go ahead and fix that real quick. I'll say class name. I'm sorry, text black. There we go. And I'm going to say hello world. And I'm going to click create. And let's go to our Convex dashboard, and you'll see that now we have a table here called to-dos, and that has our entry. Okay. Let me show you another thing. There is a show schema at the bottom. And if you were to click this, Convex is going to generate their recommended schema that you can use for the data that you currently have, right? So notice that when we tried to store stuff in Convex, it doesn't give us autocomplete for like what are our table names, okay? It's kind of like up in the air. So you can really improve the type safety by going over here and say schema.ts and just paste that in. So now if I do double quotes here and I click to-dos, notice that it shows up and we get type safety for the things that we're actually storing into that table. All right, so now let's try to get these to-dos displayed on the page somewhere. Okay, so there's another concept in Convex called a query, where we can go ahead and make a function called get to-dos equals to query. Again, this is a public query. If you want it to be private, you do internal query. This thing is going to take in a handler like so. And when you have this handler, you have access to the context here. And context, like we saw before, has a database object you can use. So I'm going to say return context.db.query. And then we have access to that to-dos table. And then I'm going to say .collect. So that'll fetch all the data that's in our to-dos table. And we can invoke this query from the front end. Now, if you're doing this with Next and React, the way Convex works is they communicate with WebSockets. So when you set up this query, I'll just say like to-dos is equal to use query, and I'll say api.todos.getTodos. When you set up this hook, this is basically connecting to Convex with WebSockets, and anytime this data changes, your UI will update. Okay, so let's go down here and notice that this is an array of to-dos, which is potentially undefined. I'm going to go down, I'm going to go right above the form. I'll say to-dos, !map, and I'll say to-do. And what we want to do is we want to return a list of to-dos .text. Okay, we can also key off of to-do ._id if you want to. So inside of here, let's just do flex. Let's say flex column gap of 4, just so that we have some nice looking to-dos. If we go back to our UI, you'll see that that to-do is actually showing up here. So now as I create new to-dos, that'll automatically get updated and displayed in the UI. Remember, we didn't have to write any manual logic to update the UI because behind the scenes, this is just getting notifications from a subscription on the WebSocket. This thing will update as your data changes, which I think is actually pretty cool. One thing I'll do is when we submit, let's just clear the text. I'll say set text is equal to empty string. And now we can go ahead and just like keep typing here like that. And I want to demo this effect one more time. So if we go to our dashboard, let's just go ahead and delete a few of these. Okay, I'll delete those documents, go back to our UI. Notice that they've all been cleared out. One thing I do want to talk about are actions. So there's this another concept. If you go through the documentation, there's something called an action. And if you ever want to integrate with a third-party API, such as like an OpenAI service or like a dictionary API, you have to use actions. Actions are a way to communicate with third-party libraries. And those actions can also invoke other mutations and queries, right? So using that context object that you get, you can do more mutations So typically the flow is you have an action, that action does an API request, you get some data back, you're going to use that data and pass it to a mutation to store it in your Convex database, and then your UI will just update if you have a query that's listening for that table or for that data. So some things that are also worth mentioning is that Convex has file storage, so you can store files directly in Convex if you want to. Authentication, they have a good walkthrough of how you can get this all set up with Clerk. I personally used Clerk on a previous Convex project, a side project, and I personally like how easy it was to get started with Clerk. There's this idea of scheduling, so you can do cron jobs and you can schedule things to run at a various point in time. I've done the scheduling a lot inside of Mutations. So for example, if you have an action over here that's trying to integrate with a third-party library, you can actually invoke it. I can say await context dot scheduler, and then I can say run after 0 milliseconds, and then I can actually call an action if we were to have one. Let's just make one real quick so I can kind of demo that. I'll say call third-party API, and this could for right now just do nothing. But now the idea is that if we were to import this API object, we can say API dot todos dot call third-party API, and that's going to kick off the action to run immediately. And we can do some logic to basically fetch from a third-party API, and then that can call a mutation, like I said, like run mutation, and then I can actually have that data store somewhere else. Okay, so that's kind of the flow with context. Once you start getting used to it, you'll realize it's actually pretty easy to just start like hooking this all together and doing a bunch of cool stuff. Another quick overview is that inside the dashboard they have the ability to view logs. So if you want to see like all the logs for a function, you can go ahead and like filter down. Again, when you're saving your files, all of your code is getting deployed to a real running like environment on a server somewhere, right? So you have access to actually hit this via an HTTP request, or like we saw with the React WebSockets, this is actually connecting to a real environment. Okay, whatever you see working on your dev environment will work when you promote this to production. Yeah, so that is about it. I just want to give a really quick overview for anyone who's interested in just kind of learning more about this before the hackathon starts next week. Other than that, if you have any questions, be sure to join my Discord and stay tuned for when I do kick off the hackathon next Wednesday. Have a good day and happy coding.